What were Leo Tolstoy's main rules for writers? And today we are going to start our journey into exploring Tolstoy's advice for writers, his books, his life, and so much more. And if you guys don't already know, my name is Ian, and here on Write Conscious, we cover the best authors and books of all time. In the past, I've made a couple videos on Tolstoy you can find down in the playlist down below, but I am now planning on making at least 100 videos on Tolstoy in the next year. And so if you are a fan of Tolstoy and want to join me on this journey, I would love to have you. But hey, enough for me. Let us now hear from the man himself, the man of the hour, Mr. Leo Tolstoy, on his rules for writers just like you. Live the lives of the people described. Describe in images their inner feelings, and the characters themselves will do what they must do according to their natures. A fiction writer needs two things. Firstly, to know thoroughly what should be, and secondly, to believe in what should be. But as he complained to a friend, immature writers have one without the other. But that isn't the most straightforward writing advice of all time. And I'm going to break it down for you guys because Tolstoy did live a very interesting life. He was born into the aristocracy and got to kind of feel what it feels like to be this wealthy figure in Russia. But he also was obviously very connected to the plight of the impoverished and wanted to give away all of his wealth to them, and even slept with one of his serfs, which I think is funny. And so there are actually some contradictions here, even in these statements. And Tolstoy lived a very contradictory life. You know, he talked about kind of being a sexual Spartan and these things, but he also impregnated one of his serfs. He talked about the plight of the poor, but he owned serfs until they were freed in 1861. But I think those contradictions, I think that even those connections and the exploration of sometimes of these polar opposite extremes does give Tolstoy the advantage in his sweeping novels to be able to move between characters. Because in War and Peace, yes, we are kind of focused on the aristocracy a lot of the time, but Planton Karatev, whatever we want to call him, sorry, my Russian pronunciation isn't great, the peasant soldier, has some of the best morality and you could say goodness of any of the characters in the novel. In Anna Karenina, Konstantin Levin is this kind of mirror of Tolstoy as this kind of Sigma man who doesn't necessarily connect with orthodoxy, but eventually refines himself much like Tolstoy did later in his life. And as you can see from what I'm saying already, Tolstoy did live the life of a lot of his main characters. I think most potently in terms of kind of the negative consequences in his novel Resurrection, there's a character named Prince Dmitri who has to eventually confront this woman from his past that he's wronged. And this obviously kind of mirrors, I think, Tolstoy's relationship with his child that he never really took accountability for. But if we return to Tolstoy's advice, when you see him say, describe in images their inner feelings. And Tolstoy builds this on one of the first principles for writers, which is contrast, because when we look at Anna, she has these thoughts that Tolstoy writes in this stream of consciousness format that kind of swirl into these internal monologues. And she's kind of moving toward hope and hopelessness. And she's like pondering these complexities of her life. But within that, sometimes there are these simple revelations or these frantic thoughts that she's having that are written like, you know, a seventh grader would write. But then sometimes there's these grandiose thoughts that only a writer such as Tolstoy could write. And this kind of movement through these internal feelings that aided by contrast is what really makes Tolstoy shine, I think, from a lot of the other Russian writers. Obviously, Dostoevsky is very good at this too in his own way. Tolstoy isn't afraid to be a maximalist. Like sometimes you're just like, you know, you're seeing people's hands trembling and stuff like that. And he's also not afraid to do free and indirect discourse and kind of move through internal thoughts and external thoughts in certain situations, like, and not to spoil anything, but like what happens to Prince Andrei in War and Peace. And so the main thing to learn from Tolstoy with this first rule is that it's built upon contrast with a lot of his characters. When we look at Anna and her feelings toward Vronsky, it's very hot and cold. And obviously that's the axiomatic root of like all romance novels, like, you know, there's got to be a problem. But he transcends that with almost all of his characters in different non-romantic scenarios. And Tolstoy takes a more intuitive point of view when he says here at the end that then the characters themselves will do what they must according to their natures. And so if you can live the lives of the people described and then figure out how through images to describe their inner feelings, then everything else, your intuition will take care of it all. And I think that's a really important lesson to learn in the environment we are here today, where there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of books on Kindle about character development and characterization. And there's a bunch of videos on here talking about how to build characters when you should just be understanding the characters, know and have the ability through gerunds, verbal adjectives, and contrast to be able to describe their inner feelings and then let it all just take care of it itself. And that will feel authentic for the reader instead of having this perfectly constructive negative arc with the 8 points of characterization and everything else that you're told to do to make a strong character. Have you ever noticed that the people who tell you to do that most of the time write very predictable characters? It's crazy. And if you want to start your journey into reading Leo Tolstoy, I've created a free guide down below that details what books you should start with Tolstoy depending on your reading level. I've ranked his novels, and I've also listed some of Tolstoy's inspirations and favorite books if you guys want to expand your reading list. So once again, go to the description below if you want that, and let's get back to the video. That's what it is, predictable. And Tolstoy's second piece of advice is a little bit more cryptic. He says, writers need two things. Firstly, to know thoroughly what should be, and secondly, to believe what should be. And this is a weird sense of dualism between kind of thought and spirit, because a lot of us have to use our logical framing of reality out in the world all the time. Like we're forced to do it to exist in capitalism and kind of function around. But then a lot of us bring that intellectualism to the writing desk, and it helps. It helped you do well in college, and it can help you be a decent writer. And it's important to building kind of the outer skeleton of the novel. But as I talk about all the time on this channel, if we are going to create a literary renaissance, we are going to need more than just just knowledge. We're going to actually have belief. We're going to have to be like, wow, this is actually important, because there are a ton of people out there who write novels that are great, that I think are cool. But when I look at them, I'm like, what was the point of this? Was this just a form of escapism? Because you are such a talented writer. You are not writing some book talk, entertaining fluff. You are writing something that you can write in a very meaningful way, but all it ended up being was escapism for me. And so writers at that level, I feel, should be utilizing their powers toward something transformative, something that they believe in their heart of hearts, something that they've lived. Because if they've lived a life, and I think maybe this is a disconnection from the world, a lot of writers and people today, we've been sterilized and neutered and don't really confront kind of the negative realities of life. If you were living here in the West like I am, you don't actually have to deal with that. I live like 40 minutes away from an actual city. And when I go to the city, I see homeless, I have to do these things. But in my town, if there's a homeless dude, they pick him up immediately, bro. The police, I don't even know what they do to him. But there are no homeless people around here. It looks like the perfect HOA town. Like, I have to confront no evil on a day-to-day basis until I get to work as a high school teacher. And then obviously I have to confront the kind of negative reality of a lot of parents and crazy choices that kids make. But to write something transformative, you have to have transformed yourself. You have to go through the process that Tolstoy actually went through. You're going to have to become something better. You're going to have to believe in radical things. Radical things are what make changes. Voting in the 2024 election for one of the pre-set up two options is not making a radical change. Even though Tolstoy obviously didn't succeed in his mission of creating change and promoting geoism or whatever in the world, because obviously the Bolshevik revolution, he still is making an impact on the world and making people contemplate some of the most important issues of life. And he got there through describing the inner feelings of people in the aristocracy, of sometimes people who were peasants. And that's how he became successful. That's why we love him. That's why we call him a great. Why do we call Dostoevsky a great? Because when you read his books, you have to confront your weird nature. You have to confront your weird maximalist nihilism and like these types of things. The same with Mishima, the same with Proust. I'm just speaking of like internal maximalist authors. But Tolstoy knew that a lot of writers have one without the other. There are a lot of people who have a deep belief and they have this radicalism and these convictions that they want to change things, but they have no knowledge. If you look at the youth, if you look at people all throughout history who want to change, including the Bolsheviks, they didn't attach that to knowledge. And so a fiction writer needs both of those things, because to become great, to be able to put together a novel like War and Peace or Crime and Punishment or whatever, you have to be a pretty smart and talented individual. It does require a sense of organization, and you have to know where you are going. You have to know the principles of writing, and to create that. You don't just get to say, hey, I have all these transformational things and now I can write a novel. People do that all the time, and it ends up in the slush pile and the Kindle graveyard. But if you can combine those two things together, if you have talent and knowledge and know what should be, and then if you believe in that thing, that's where the magic happens. And unfortunately today, people are not smart enough, I'll just say it, not intellectual enough to understand that, not well-read enough to understand that as an author. When you look at people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, these guys were in the aristocracy. When you look at most of the authors behind me, they had very enriching upbringings. There are some exceptions, much more than you and I. They learned and got to experience much more than you and I did in the American or European public school system or wherever you're from. And people actually used to be, interestingly enough, radical back then in different ways. Like, people today think that, like, oh, MAGA or Black Lives Matter, like, I'm a radical. That's radical. Or I'm a socialist. I'm a revolutionary chick. Or I'm a libertarian. And it's like, guys, have you read, early 20th century history? Have you looked at some of the figures like the Bolsheviks or like Julius Evola over on the fascist side? Have you seen how radical guys like Nietzsche and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Ezra Pound, like all these guys, like they were on the edge. They make, whoever today look like, a Bud Light. They actually believed, and they were smart too. And that obviously created a lot of problems like World War II and World War I. But it also created a lot of great literature, because a lot of these thinkers like Tolstoy believed in, a very divergent view of politics and spirituality. Guys like Julius Evola, who called himself a super fascist, was one of the first people to kind of integrate Eastern philosophy with right-wing politics. Communists were doing the same thing. Like, these were very unique ideologies. Like, who do you hear today up at the top of our philosophical or fiction apexes talking about, stuff like that? It doesn't happen very often, because once again, we've been sterilized, we've been locked down, and things have become so meta that people can't gain that type of ascension. If someone did something like that, they'd be canceled and broken down immediately by a bunch of YouTubers and people on Reddit. And that goes for someone, a radical on either side of the aisle. And so thank you guys for going on this journey with me. Shout out Leo Tolstoy. Praise to him for everything that he did. Praise to you guys for giving praise to him and spending time with me. And I will see you guys very soon in another video on Tolstoy.